Why is death so bad?
Because it's the end of life. Death is not the second worst thing that can happen to you, it's the worst thing that can happen to you. It's not even a question of death is bad. Bad or good isn't the issue. You're just not there. It's the disappearance of everything. There's nothing I can imagine worse than that. Being dead to me means not being forever. People tell me they're not afraid to die. I ask them, if I put a loaded gun at your head and threaten to pull the trigger, will you be afraid? And they say, yes. Well, then you're afraid to die. I hear people all the time that say, well, I'm not really afraid of dying. What I'm afraid is growing old. Well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Growing old is the process by which you die. One of my heroes has always been Dr. Frankenstein. People often see Dr. Frankenstein as some horror story. I just think he's been misunderstood.
First I experimented only with dead animals. But now I am going to turn that ray on that body and endow it with life.
Around the age of 24 or 25, I came across an article in Playboy magazine, June of 1964, called Intimations of Immortality. It talked about various ways in which aging would be controlled in the future and how lifespans would be extended. And it had one small paragraph, for those of you who can't wait, we have something for you as well. And he mentioned a book called The Prospect of Immortality by Robert C.W. Ettinger. They talked about what was then just called freezing people. The word cryonics hadn't been invented yet. I ran off to the beach, which is where I used to spend a lot of my time in those days, and I read the book, and that got me involved in actually doing something about aging and death. I was among the people who started the first cryonics organization in August 1965. We were involved in several of the early freezings. It's one thing to talk about freezing people, it's another thing to actually do it. The word cryonics comes from a fellow named Carl Werner who was working with us in New York. He just made it up, and about 5 years later it was in the dictionary. The idea is to take a person at the point that he or she is dying and to lower their body temperature down to the temperature of, say, liquid nitrogen, which is minus 320 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. You take out the person's blood and you replace it with a chemical solution that protects against freezing damage, sort of an antifreeze. The final stage is you put them into something which is a lot like a thermos bottle, except it's about 8 feet high. That person would go through a form of time travel, and perhaps 100 years from now, perhaps 200 years from now, perhaps 300 years from now, medicine would advance to the point where the person could be thawed, the damage repaired, and the person brought back to life. This appealed to me as a means of possibly avoiding death should I be faced with it, but I also saw it as a means of publicizing and promoting the idea of extending lifespan. My objective was not to be frozen and come back. What I really wanted to do was not to die at all. My mother's reaction when I got involved in cryonics was interesting. She saw it as being impractical in terms of a career. She was always concerned about you have to get a real job in the real world and make money. One of the early freezings I was involved in, there was a woman dying at New York University Hospital, and at the time I was living with my mother in the Bronx. I was eating supper, and I got a call that there was an emergency and I had to get down there, and I was about to go, and she says, "Finish your pears." You know, I was in the middle of eating dessert. My mother was around 40 years of age when I was born, so she was older than most mothers. And I was an only child. My father died when I was 10 months old, and of course I don't recall it at all. And my mother never remarried, so I never really had a father. He died of rheumatic heart disease, which is essentially an infection that attacks the heart. And that is readily curable and preventable now. People don't die of rheumatic heart disease anymore. If my father had been frozen, he easily could have been cured of rheumatic heart disease, even now, or even maybe a year or so after he died. My mother was both mother and father to me, and she was very devoted to me. She brought me up by herself. She stayed in the house and worked as a dressmaker at home. It wasn't until I was about 14 or 15 before she went out and got a job. My mother really believed in being independent and having as much freedom as possible, and I learned a lot of the way I am today from my mother. The independence she showed and the dedication she showed. I learned a great deal from her, and I owe a lot to her. Ultimately, when I arranged to have her frozen, I was really, in a sense, freezing both my parents. When I first got involved in the 60s, I had made legal and financial preparations to be frozen. But my mother never did at that point. It isn't that she wasn't interested, it's that we really couldn't afford it. She was already getting on in years, and it's more expensive to get life insurance, which is the way in which most people pay for this procedure. Incidentally, this is truly life insurance. When people sell you life insurance now, it's really death insurance. It's someone else's life that benefits, not yours. This is true life insurance. This is meant to be for you and no one else. In later years, when she went into her 70s, by then I was much more successful, had substantially more money, and I arranged to have her frozen. One morning, I got a call. One of the neighbors said that my mother had been out walking and she didn't look like she really was fully aware of what was going on. I realized that there had been a dramatic change. Suddenly, she wasn't the person I had known my entire life. She was remembering things that never existed. She got a bit paranoid. She said, well, I guess it's time to freeze me. She knew death was near. I got a call at about 2 a.m. The nurse said my mother had almost died a few minutes ago and she was desperately trying to revive her. I decided to have her brought directly into the facility at which she was going to be frozen. That was the mistake in terms of dealing with the authorities. The people who pronounced her dead really were qualified to do so, but the problem was it was seen as a conflict of interest. The people who are freezing her are also the people who are pronouncing her dead. My mother was a neuro patient. I had chosen to have essentially just her brain frozen because her body was really in bad shape. She was very frail and she had all kinds of problems. The reason we freeze the entire head is that the skull protects the brain. If you had to dissect the brain out, it would be worse. It's better to do it within the head. Now, this is done about 12 hours normally after the freezing process is started. And this is what was done in my mother's case. Her head was separated from her body surgically, but 12 hours after the process started and 12 hours after she was pronounced dead. And of course, 4 years and 12 hours after she really began to die. And the next morning, there's a knock on the door about noon, and it's a camera crew. Can we have some of your comments about the story that appeared in the Riverside paper? And I said, sure, what is this all about? He asked if I'd seen the story. I said, no. It said, although Dora Kent died of pneumonia Coroners are looking into the possibility that she was still alive when her head was removed. Within the hour, there were crews that came to my house. There were crews that came to the facility where she was being stored. There were crews that showed up at the coroner's office. It was a 3-ring circus, or probably a 4-ring circus. There were many rings in the circus.
The administrator, Mike Darwin, who participated in the removal of Mrs. Kent's head, said there were a number of people in the operating room who would confirm she was clinically dead.
We're not stupid. We're not that stupid. I admit we've made some errors in judgment that I wish we hadn't made. But we are not foolish enough to start this procedure before someone is in full cardiac and respiratory arrest.
I get a call from someone at the facility, and he says, they're here. They've got the police, they've got, I don't know, fire engines, everything in the world, and they're there with a search warrant to autopsy my mother's brain. Except for one problem, it wasn't there.
The frozen head of 83-year-old Dora Kent is missing. It had been stored here at the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, but after the Riverside County Coroner's Office began an investigation into her death, the head vanished. In the meantime, the questions remain. Who has Dora Kent's head, and how did she die?
They were furious, and they started threatening all kinds of things, threatening to defrost all the patients, threatening to throw people in jail. Nobody knew where my mother was. She was safe and she was secure, but she was not there. They were talking about doing all this investigating, but they weren't doing a damn thing. They were just posturing, flailing their arms about and, playing cops and robbers. Was operating out of a couple of motels near Ontario Airport. A motel got 2 phones in there, was constantly on the phone. Only a few people knew where I was. They were after me and some of the other people like mad. That 17 days, I and some other people and the attorneys were working nonstop, continuously, to get the documentation. We wanted expert witnesses, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. We needed legal arguments, case law, all kinds of things in an unprecedented situation.
Saul, I know you haven't really talked about this, but I really, really want to know, where was the head during all of this time?
I really don't want to comment on that. It was at a private person's residence. It was not at mine. A private person was maintaining it in their residence. That's where it was.
What do you mean a private person is maintaining?
A residence. Someone took it home.
A Riverside lab that freezes human remains for future resuscitation won a victory in court today. A judge issued a preliminary injunction forbidding the county coroner from thawing and examining the cryonically frozen head of Dora Kent. The whereabouts of Dora Kent's head are unknown, but it is believed that her son has hidden it somewhere.
It was a matter of face. These authorities had put themselves in a position where they had made these public statements saying that there had been grand theft, that there had been murder. The truth is they never charged anybody with anything, not even a speeding ticket. You have the health police, you have the Food and Drug Administration. They have rules, they have regulations. We break all of them. They hate us with complete disregard for whether we're doing anybody any good or not, because the fact that we're saving lives is totally irrelevant to them. We're challenging their authority, and they're gonna put their foot down, and it's essentially a war which will either end in us being put out of business and perhaps in prison, or will lead to radical changes in government. I'm betting on the second.
Our guest is Saul Kent, the son of Dora Kent. He runs the Life Extension Foundation.
Hello, Larry. Welcome back.
Thank you.
This guy is a nut. I want to know something.
He's not. Hold it. Don't demean the guest. Just ask the question.
Why didn't he freeze everything? Why just the head?
Well, because she was extremely elderly. She had atherosclerosis, she had osteoporosis, and I thought she needed a new body, which the future will bring. You can say, well, someone is 80 and they're coming back in the body of a 20-year-old, but actually it's going to be far better than that. In the future, you will come back in the body that's far better than any 20-year-old is today. It goes beyond the idea of the Superman. All Superman suggests is superpowers, but the same as we have now. We're going to have powers far beyond that. You want to experience what it's like to be a man or a woman? You can do so for a while and switch back. Right now, there are people who are transsexuals who actually have operations that change them from men into women and from women into men. But it's pretty bad, and it doesn't work very well. In the future, you'll be able to do that very easily, just like changing your clothes. Identity is going to be one of the major subjects, both in terms of study and in terms of practical implications. The question of who you are, who you want to be, who you're becoming, and who you want to end up as, or whether you want to end up as anyone. In the future, people may have more than one body. Your brain necessarily wouldn't have to be in your body. You aren't your body. You are your feelings about yourself, your feelings about other people. That's your essence. And if that could be transferred into another body, it would still be you. I mean, you might wake up and say, wow, I'm real different today. This is pretty hard to comprehend, but these kinds of things are going to be possible. You could perhaps have adaptations. It might be perfectly desirable to have a much smaller body temporarily. The name of the game is options and freedom. The more freedom you have, the more options you have, the better off you are. By the end of the 21st century, there may be more differences compared to the way we are now than there are between us and the apes. Not just revolution, it's radical evolution as well. We're going to be a new species. This is why we're in the beginning of a truly radical period, and the idea of controlling aging and extending lifespan is just one small part of it. I think it's the most important part because survival is the thing that's most important to me. I now think there are 5 categories of people: hardcore deathists, softcore deathists, closet immortalists, softcore immortalists, and hardcore immortalists. I consider myself a hardcore immortalist. People often say, oh, I wouldn't want to be 20 again, because they think of the way they were psychologically, and I agree. If you're 40, 50, or 60, you never want to be back to the way you were 20, but physically, that's something else. When we have people who are physically like they were when they were 20 and 30, and experientially are 80, 90, and 100, you're going to have people who are going to be unbelievable. People have all kinds of fears. If someone is afraid of being brought back to life in a very bad situation where an alternative possibility is to be brought back to be young, fair, and debonair for centuries, and if they're not willing to take that risk, that's fine. They can be dead forever. It's their choice. I think everyone has the right to be dead forever. I think it's an inalienable right, guaranteed by the Constitution and whatever else. There's always a risk, I suppose, if you're frozen, that someone can bring you back as a monster. That's why being frozen is not a very good state to be in. You're totally under the control of other people. Sure, you could come back in all kinds of horrible situations, but people only choose to be frozen when there's no other hope. When my mother comes back, number one, they're going to have to repair the damage to her brain. Since she no longer has a body and her head is aged, they would then, and this will be possible 100 years in the future, they will then grow a younger version of her body around her repaired, youthful brain. There's a real possibility she'll be younger than I am. It would be the kind of reunion that's never happened before. We may become, at some point, more like friends and less like mother and son. It's hard to describe what it would be like. Not only would we have the entire past to discuss, but we'd have potentially an illimitable future. Those of us who survive the transition will remember what it was like to grow old and die and to have traditional relationships between parents, between lovers, between friends. It's all going to be very different. People who grow up to be immortal will not be able to really understand a lot of what we understand because we remember the way it was. They'll also say there were hundreds of millions of people, billions of people who had a possibility of this long and healthy and indefinite life, and almost none of them took advantage of it. Many people, because of the fact that they don't feel in control of their own lives, fear any type of change. There are people who would like to go back 100 years in the past and live in the past. They don't realize that things were really much more horrible than the way you see in the past on television. The good old days were not good. And although it's far better now than it was today, the fact is that we're moving towards far better times.
If in the future you meet your mom again, what would be the first thing you'd like to say to her, you imagine yourself saying to her?
I'd say, Mom, we're now in paradise together and we're going to try for the next form of paradise. I'd say it worked. It really worked. That would be quite remarkable, to wake up a couple hundred years in the future and said that 200 years ago they almost slashed your brain into pieces and here you are alive.
By the way, where is your mother now?
I'd rather not comment about that. There's no statute of limitation on murder, and I'd rather not reveal where she is. Just rather not. Maybe in 100 years.